Good evening, everyone. If you are joining us on the live stream, you are watching the Poway Unified School District K12 Budget Basics webinar with Associate Superintendent Ron Little. We'll get started momentarily as we allow for the participants to come in. Hello, everyone. You are joining the Poway Unified School District K12 Budget Basics webinar with Associate Superintendent Ron Little. And we're going to get started momentarily, and we just have a few more people joining. Thank you for coming tonight. Okay, I see the participant number slowing down as people join. Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Christine Peck. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the Poway Unified School District, and you are attending the Poway Unified School District K12 Budget Basics. And we wanted to do this webinar because we got a lot of the same questions over and over again when it came to school budgeting and finance. And so we wanted to make sure that we could share with you a lot of the information that we think is really useful in understanding K-12 budget. And so we're happy to have our presenter, Ron Little. He's the Associate Superintendent of Business Support Services. And we know as the presentation goes along, you might have some questions. And so we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. But during the presentation, if you could, just keep yourself muted. And then when it's time for Q&A, we'll ask you to raise your hand and we'll just call on you individually for you to be able to ask questions and interact with Mr. Little. So without further ado, Mr. Little, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Peck, for that introduction. I appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, this evening, good evening, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. Our goal this evening is to provide you with some interesting and hopefully some valuable information over the next hour or so. And then, as Ms. Peck noted, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So tonight, we hope to paint a broad picture of K-12 funding in California, its origins and its evolution, and primarily our focus will be on the operations of the district's main operating fund, the general fund. We'll also review the district's plans to expend the one-time resources that we've received with respect to mitigate the impacts of the COVID pandemic. So we thought it was important just to have a better understanding of the context of the current funding model and how we got here and how it lines up to prior funding models to sort of give a broad overview, a quick sweeping look through history of K-12 funding in the state of California. We've noted here on this slide just a few of the historic highlights over the past 4 or 5 decades. And we're going to touch on these in a little more detail over the next few slides. And I sort of put this together in fable form because some of it is almost fairy tale-like, and the evolution is quite storyboard-ish. So once upon a time ago, maybe going back 6 decades or so, as you may remember, local school boards had the ability to levy taxes. So school boards generated revenues for their mission, obviously, of educating their students, by levying taxes on the property owners within its boundaries. In this simplified example, Paradise School District, with assessed property values of $1 billion, can generate $10 million annually for its students through a 1% annual tax levy on its property owners. Because revenues were based on a percent of the assessed property values, obviously some districts had the ability to generate more funding than others. So for example, East Paradise School District, right across the highway from Paradise School District, has a total assessed property value of $350 million. And for the same 1% tax levy, obviously it can only generate $3.5 million of revenues annually. So assuming that Paradise School District and East Paradise School District were similar in size, then this means that East Paradise School District could only generate about 1/3 of the funding for its students compared to its neighbor, Paradise School District, with the higher property values. So this did not escape the public's notice, and in 1968, a parent challenged the inequity of the system, and the case known as Serrano versus Priest eventually works its way up to the Supreme Court, which found that the current funding model was in fact constitutionally deficient. Essentially, the Supreme Court said that the current funding model at that time denied the students in less wealthy districts equal protection that was guaranteed in terms of securing their educational opportunities. In 1971, ahead of the Supreme Court's decision, California reformed the model to include a maximum on the amount of revenues that a school district could generate. So this was done through legislation, obviously Senate Bill 90 in 1971. This model was known as the revenue limit model, and it created a ceiling, as I mentioned, on the amount of revenues that a district could receive or raise in any given year. And it served as the California K12 funding model for over 4 decades to follow. The revenue limit model was formulaic. There's always algebra involved in school district funding, it seems. We have each district had a base revenue limit, which was loosely based on the amount of revenue it was generating the year prior that this went into effect. And then there was an adjustment for the size of the district, right, based on your ADA. So ADA is an acronym that means average daily attendance. We'll see that a little bit later. I should have defined it sooner. Average daily attendance is simply how many days out of the total number of school days a student comes to class times the student population. So if a school district has 1,000 students and they come to school on average 96% of their time, their ADA would be 0.96 times 1,000 or 960. So ADA is very closely related to enrollment, but it's not, a one-for-one on student enrollment. And then we add to that adjustment any annual adjustments, such as cost of living adjustments, right? And those kind of mechanisms to ratchet up the base. And in addition, because the court and the state did recognize the disparity among the prior model, there was this equalization factor that was added into the mix that was a mechanism to level up those districts that had been traditionally underfunded or were lower funded districts. That said, however, one group of school districts benefited by way of a carve out. For these school districts, their share of the property tax revenues exceeded their formulaic revenue limit entitlement. So that means if school district B was entitled under this new revenue limit model to $10 million of revenues each year. In their case, their property tax revenues might be 12 million. And those districts were allowed to keep the difference. So all of the excess property taxes that a basic aid district, as these districts were known, generated in excess of their revenue entitlement, they were permitted to keep. They're known as basic aid school districts because at that point, any gaps between the revenue limit entitlement and what you could raise through property taxes, any gap was funded by the state. So there was this move from school districts being funded entirely by local property taxes to now being funded by a combination of property taxes, local property taxes, and state aid. If you're a basic aid district, and your property taxes exceed your entitlement, obviously there's no aid from the state required. So the basic aid piece is that the state still gave them a little bit for some other purposes, and that's why they were called basic aid. So as I said, this went into effect in 1971, and then in 1978, of course, as you may recall, we had Prop 13 passed by the voters. Prop 13 significantly limited the amount of revenues that could be generated through local taxes. And again, it further shifted the evolution of that sort of bifurcation of funding between local property taxes and state aid to a greater proportion of state aid, given the constraints around the amount of taxes that could be levied and raised locally. And by doing that, of course, there's this shift from local control, right, by local school boards to more centralized control by the state of California. So obviously, the more that the state is ponying up and providing in terms of state aid, the more say they're going to have in how those monies are spent. And that's what we're going to see as we go through this. Let's see here. Okay. And so this revenue limit model existed for some time, pluses and minuses. And then sort of in response to the Prop 13 effort, which was a constraint on the revenue side of the school funding or the public sector funding equation, Paul Gann spearheaded Prop 13, which tackled the expenditure side of the public sector equation. So Prop 13 effectively placed a spending limit known as the Gann limit for Mr. Paul, which basically limited the rate at which government spending could grow year over year. So after nearly a decade of revenue and expenditure constraints and the pluses and minuses and the roller coastering of that, school funding reform came to the forefront. So, excuse me. So in 1988, the voters of California approved Proposition 98, which is still with us. It provided us schools, both community colleges and K12s, with a constitutionally guaranteed piece of the state budget pie. So under Prop 98, schools are guaranteed a certain level of funding based on state revenues and the projections in the state budgets. And when it was passed, Prop 98 was meant to be a funding floor for K12s and for community college districts, meaning that this is the bare minimum that schools are going to receive from the state in order to pursue their mission. We can add to that in sundry ways, but schools should be able to count on this minimum level of funding. And what we have seen since its implementation in 1988 is actually Prop 98 works more like a ceiling, and it's very rare that schools are granted more funding than the Prop 98 formula allows for. The revenue limit model itself became even more complicated, given that obviously it was managed by the state. So Prop 98 has its own challenges. There's 3 different tests in any given year to see what that level will be funding, and we won't go into the minutia. But by 2012, there were over 40 categorical programs. These were all state categorical programs that had distinct spending and reporting requirements that were tacked on to the revenue limit base, basically. And I list a few examples here. So the Arts and Music Block Grant, Adult Ed, Instructional Materials Realignment Program, et cetera, et cetera. So 40 other programs, 40 other pots of money for school districts to apply for, sometimes to compete against, and then of course monitor, track, report, and expend strategically. So then the most recent move was away from sort of that centralized, complex, complicated revenue limit model and into a model that the state called the local control funding formula. So this is the model that we're currently under. This was implemented in 2013. The benefit of this particular model is it did away with most of those 40 categorical grant programs and enfolded many of them into the LCFF base, although not all of them. Like the revenue limit model before it, funding in the LCFF is based on student attendance, as we talked about, not on a district's enrollments. So obviously, the more the students come to school, the more funding a district receives for its students. We noted here Poway Unified's attendance rate over the past 4 years or so to show sort of how consistent it is and how good it is. 96.7, anything over 96 is good. And obviously, if we could get to 97, that's been our goal for quite a few years. We get close, but we haven't gotten there quite yet. But we do hope to get there soon. So the mechanism for the local control funding formula is also formulaic driven. So there's 4 grade spans, each has a base grant, and that provides the bulk of the unrestricted funding that schools receive. And then additional funding is provided to school districts based on what's called the UPP. That's the unduplicated pupil percentage. It represents the number of foster youth, English learners, and students from lower socioeconomic households compared to the total student population. So, for example, here in Poway, about 22.5% of our 36,000 students fall into one of those 3 categories. And so our UPP number is about 22.5%. By comparison, the larger school district down the street, San Diego Unified, has a UPP of about 58%. A district just north of us has a UPP of 77%. The higher your UPP, the more funding you get for students. And we'll see how that plays out a little bit in terms of the numbers in the subsequent slide. So obviously, one of our goals as a district is try to increase our UPP numbers, right? And so that's why there's been a push over the last couple of years to have our students be sure to submit their free and reduced lunch program applications, because those are what drive the UPP numbers and the UPP data. So this is just a graphic comparison of the prior model, the revenue limit, versus the new model, the LCFF model. So as we mentioned, under the revenue limit model, a lot of categorical programs, especially those with the higher UPP numbers versus those with the low UPP numbers. And when we move to the LCFF funding model, you can see that some of those were brought into the base funding, again, but not all. And then we have a larger share of grant funds available through what we call supplemental grants and concentration grants. Poway Unified qualifies for supplemental grant funding based on our UPP numbers, but we do not receive any concentration grant funding based on our UPP numbers. And so what does that mean? It means that in 2019-20, for example, looking at the other unified school districts across the county, factoring the UPP number into the formula, Poway Unified was the lowest unified district in the county. So an apples to apples comparison, this is an LCFF per ADA. So loosely, for every student that we educate, we received $9,112 in that year, compared with San Diego Unified, who received $10,610 for every student that they educated in that year. So almost a 16.5% difference between the resources that they had to work with and what we here at Poway Unified have had to work with. And that's been true since the implementation of the model. So since 2013, once the LCFF was implemented, Poway's pretty much had to do more with fewer resources than our neighboring districts. And we should say here also that the basic aid districts that we addressed earlier are still in existence. So the LCFF did not mitigate the basic aid districts, right? So they still exist under this model, and they are still, receiving the excess property taxes. And so if we were to list some of the basic aid districts on this slide, like Del Mar or San Diego, we would see their LCFF per ADA, or their funding per ADA, considerably higher than those that we see on this chart. So one of the goals of the LCFF was to strengthen or re-strengthen local control, which was lost, as we noted, under the revenue limit model. So the LCFF model provides for the local control and accountability plan. And I note here sort of the purposes of that plan. And it's really meant to tie the resource allocation of the resources that the district receives to the local district's educational goals and priorities. The state did, of course, set, eight conditions for learning and 8 overarching areas that they wanted to see targeted through the LCFF. And so we and the board come up with goals and objectives aligned with those particular state objectives. All right, so that's pretty much the history and how we got to where we're at. And we're going to turn our attention now to the district's funds. Here we list the funds. We have 3 main types of funds. We have operating funds, we have capital funds, and we have an enterprise fund. Operating funds are just like they sound. They are the funds that are responsible for specific operations of the district. So our main operating fund is the general fund, and that's where we do most of our work, 90% of our work with respect to educating students. We have an adult education operating fund, a child development operating fund, our food nutrition program, our lunch program is Fund 13, et cetera, et cetera. We have about 5 different capital funds. We're going to talk about capital funding a little bit later. And the reason that we're going to address it is because under the LCFF model, school districts in California do not receive funding for facility renovation, facility modernization, major facility repairs. There's no resources provided to the schools by the state under the LCFF to keep their schools and facilities in good repair. So that's a challenge that is faced by all 1,000 school districts across the state. And then finally, an enterprise fund is one that's almost like a business. It operates sort of in a self-perpetuating manner. It takes in revenues. It's a fee-based service program, and it basically operates with the bottom line in mind, and designs programs that are community-based and fee-based, based on the needs of its particular mission. All right, so we're going to turn our attention to the general fund. The general fund here at Poway Unified, and again, we've used, for all of our numbers here, we're using 2019, 2020 numbers, because those are the last set of actual numbers that we have. And that was sort of the last normal year that we've had, unfortunately, as we all know. So in that year, we had about $404 million of revenues. 80% of those came from the LCFF model. About 14% came from other state funding. I note some examples like the lottery, some special education funding for mental health services, a workability program, et cetera, et cetera. 3.5% came from local sources. Local revenues include any interest we derive from our investments or our funds sitting in the county treasurer, any rent or lease on our facilities. As you know, we have a bus pass program, so those bus pass fees and the revenues generated by those go in here. And any donations we receive from the community go into local revenues. Our federal revenues are all grants, so Title I, Title II, Title III, all with specific targeted outcomes and objectives and goals, and all sort of reaching out towards specific student populations. And then there's just some transfers in from some other funds, just sort of as we move funds in between our own internal funds. So of those revenues, we have a breakdown. Some are restricted and some are unrestricted. As the names imply, the unrestricted funds the district can use pretty much as we see fit. The restricted funds are mostly grants and some donations that have obviously what I would say are strings attached, right, in a nice way, and that have certain reporting requirements and spending requirements that we have to follow. And I list some examples of each here. So obviously the biggest source of unrestricted revenues are our LCFF funds and so forth. And again, I mentioned that the restricted funds are primarily grants. So all the federal money that we have are very restricted with very strict expenditure guidelines about how we can expend them, et cetera, et cetera. And that's fairly consistent across all school districts throughout the state. In terms of expenditures, so how do we spend that $405 million of revenues? About 84% we spend on staff, on doing the work of the district. So on our teachers, our principals, our custodians, our admin assistants, our counselors, all the staff it takes to provide quality education and support to our teachers here at Poway. On average, statewide, most districts spend in the neighborhood of 85% to 87% on salary and benefits. I noted here that many of our neighboring school districts are closer to 90% and some even exceed 90%. So we're in a good state in terms of what we're expending on salaries and benefits. Obviously, if we add more resources, we could arguably, allocate more towards our staffing. And then we have a breakdown of the other areas that we spend our monies on. So books and supplies, about 7%. Services, which include, utilities and all our fixed costs, 7.5%. You see, there is a little bit of capital outlay there, even though I said the LCFF doesn't give us money for capital outlay. And it's so little, right? And that's because obviously we do have to, change carpets in our classrooms when they're threadbare. We do have to put a new coat of paint on classroom walls when they need it. And that's a minimal amount of money, 0.3%, applied to 39 schools across the district. So that's that piece. And then we note here, there are some programs that we have to do, obviously as part of our mission, that we don't receive sufficient funding for. So obviously special education is high on the list. Right now we're subsidizing, I would say that we are, moving some of our unrestricted resources from the LCFF to our restricted resources. Special education is a restricted program, to the tune of about $48 million each year. We do have a requirement by the state that we spend 3% of our expenditures on what they call routine, regular, restricted maintenance. So this would be, as I just mentioned, the normal day-to-day, changing a light bulb, replacing a ballast that needs to be replaced, changing out a broken window, fixing a broken door. It's the normal day-to-day wear and tear on buildings that we have to take care of. So some custodians fall into here. Our grounds and maintenance team members fall under here. And any projects like maybe slurry sealing a parking lot over the summer might come out of this particular account. And it's particularly underfunded. In tough economic years, when the state doesn't have all the money to give the districts what they're due, they'll relax this requirement and maybe drop the requirement from a 3% requirement to 2%, just because they realize that this is a tough one, given that they're not funding us to the level that they should. We have a little bit of subsidization of our transportation program, and similarly with the Career Tech Ed program, which used to be a categorical program under the revenue limit model, and now is not being funded to the extent that it was in the past. So one of the mandates we have as a district is we have general fund revenues, we have general fund expenditures. The delta between whatever we don't spend at the end of the year goes into our reserves. So if we start with 400 million and we spend only 395 million, then that extra or that leftover $5 million at the end of the year falls into our reserves. And the state, by Ed Code, has its own requirements about what those reserve levels should look like for a school district based on the size of the school district. So again, ADA is not exactly enrollment, right? But it equates generally to enrollment. So our district is about 36,000 students. Our ADA is somewhere around 35,500-ish. So we fall into that group of school districts that the state requires a 2% minimum reserve of. And you can see how the other districts fall out here. Of course, a 2% reserve is not much, right? A 2% reserve represents for us about $8.5 million. And, in some kind of economic downturn or uncertain events, that would only, cover 10 days of payroll. Here's an accounting or a history of our own. These are our Poway Unified School District fund balance and reserve levels over the past 10 years. So you can see that Poway Unified has a good track record of maintaining prudent reserve levels, well in excess of the state's mandate of a 2% reserve. They've ranged anywhere from a low of 8% one year to a high of 17.5% another year, for an average of about 12.9% over the 10-year period. And as you may or may not know, our current board has set 10% as the target minimum reserve level for the general fund reserves. And that's about 2 months of payroll, so much more prudent than the state required reserve. And so why maintain adequate reserves, right? Why is that important? Why is having a significant or a substantial amount of reserves in the bank important? Obviously, I won't read all these to you, but it's a cushion, right? Just like we like to have cushions in our checking accounts as individuals and as homeowners. School districts too need to have a cushion, and the state itself, right? So one of Governor Newsom's uh, focuses, and Jerry Brown before him, was to build up the rainy day fund, increasing the state's cushion or its reserve levels so that, last year, prior to the COVID pandemic and prior to the large influx of federal dollars, mostly one time and COVID related, the state had to use its reserves, dip into them to fund school districts instead. So now just talking about the school district budget cycle, this is general fund centric, very dynamic, right? So, in January of every year, the governor comes out and tells us what he thinks next year's budget's going to look like. We start planning accordingly, start with our LCAP work. We talked about the LCAP and talk about our goals and objectives for the subsequent year. By May, those plans are well underway and almost finalized. And then we get the governor's May revise, which is an update to his proposed budget for next year. That may change and will change sort of our own planning. The state adopts its budget ideally in June. We do the same. In the past, it wasn't infrequent that the state adopted its budget after we did, which was problematic. Recently, it's been a little bit better. And then we have some required reporting cycles, like our first interim and our second interim, where we're just reporting out to the board and the public how we're doing in any given fiscal year with respect to against our budget, with respect to expenditures and revenues. And that's part of the cycle. And then as we're going through that, we're actually closing the books for the prior year, auditing our books and our actuals, as we call them, and then sharing those numbers with the board and the public, again, in an effort of transparency and to assess where we've been and how well we did against where we thought we were going to go. Because really the budget is about aligning the resources with the goals and the plans and the objectives of the board and of district leadership and of the district and where we want to go educationally speaking. I added this slide just as sort of another minutia piece that is involved in state budgeting. Imagine that you're employed by an employer, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to pay you $100,000 a year to do this job." And then after the first month, you get your first month's paycheck. In month 2, he comes, he says, times are really hard, and I'm not going to be able to pay you next month's salary in entirely, but I'll give you what I can't give you 6 months later. And the next month he comes and he says, I can't give you what I should have to give you this time around, but I'll give you the difference, 2 months from now. And so these are called deferrals, and they're a mechanism that the state uses when the state feels it's in tough economic times and is having cash flow challenges of its own to balance its own budget, to be honest, right? So this year, they're deferring something like, something like 35% of our district revenues, or 40% of our district revenues from the current fiscal year into next fiscal year. So not only are we not getting our payments when we anticipate them and expect to receive them, but we're not even receiving them in the fiscal year for which we have to expend them. So as you can imagine, that's quite complicated and quite problematic. It forces many school districts, including us, to take out short-term loans to cover the gaps. Loans, of course, have interest. And so again, just one more sort of piece of the puzzle that we have to think about as we're developing our own budgets, our own cash flow analysis with respect to California school district funding. I think our next topic is COVID funds, right? So as I mentioned, um, we have, since the pandemic began in March of 2019, we have been receiving mitigation funds from both the state and the federal government. I've listed them here in the order that we've received them. So the first set of funds and resources that we received was through the CARES Act and so forth. The most recent ones, not so long ago, the Extended Learning Opportunities, just last month, and the In-Person Learning Grant was part of that as well. In many cases, these funds were allocated in proportion to a district's LCFF entitlement. So that whole UPP factoring and what I would call the disparity of district funding, right, across the state and across the county in general, factored into how they distributed these funds as well. And so many school districts in our area receive, because we have a low UPP number, again, we receive probably the lowest amount of COVID funding compared to, on a per pupil basis, compared to other unified districts in that same chart. They would have received significantly more. And of course, not all of them opened their doors, right, as early as we did at Poway. So again, just another challenge to keep in mind as we think about resources and how we expend them. So $78.4 million of one-time COVID funds, again, to help us with the impacts of the pandemic. So making sure that our sites are safe and secure, making sure that our staff have what they need in terms of personal protection equipment, making sure that we have alternative pedagogical modalities available and funded, making sure that we have additional teachers. And actually, here's how we have expended or plan to expend that $78.4 million. So obviously these are wide, broad swaths of categories, but just some examples. You know, we spent over $10 million on technology devices, making sure that we implemented our one-to-one initiative where every student had a device that he or she could learn from and with, making sure that everyone had access to the internet, and high quality internet was important. The whole rollout of the virtual learning required, you know, teachers, required professional development and training, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we added 35 additional teachers this year with some of this money. We anticipate adding 40 more teachers-ish next year to lower class sizes even further. We're increasing our support for social and emotional supports of students. So additional counselors, additional psychologists, additional classroom support for students and for teachers. We have some social workers that we'll be hiring. We've supported our meal program. Once the COVID pandemic hit, we lost obviously our revenues that we would generate through our meal program at the schools. And we were mandated, and we wanted to make sure that all of our students received nutritious meals. So we were feeding all of our students for the past, year plus. So that requires some resources, and we're looking at about $5 million to fund that as well. Extended learning opportunities, so summer school programs, which have been enhanced, enrichment programs be part of that, additional tutoring, et cetera, for about $3 million. So that's a broad look, a high level look at how we have expended or will expend these funds. We've been reporting these out publicly at board meetings. So at our last board meeting last week, Associate Superintendent Osborne did a nice report on our Extended Learning Opportunities Grant and how we were using those resources to help our students and our staff. At our next board meeting on June 3rd, I believe it is, we'll look at how we're spending the in-person instruction grant money. We've reported out on the ESSER 2 and the ESSER 3, et cetera, in prior board meetings. So Again, we try to be very transparent with how we're planning to utilize these funds as we move through the next year. I should have mentioned that each of these have varying deadlines to expend and reporting requirements, right? So some of this money has to be spent by the end of next year. Other of these pots of money have to be spent the next year out. And even another pot of money we have till the end of fiscal year 2024, so September of 24 to expend. So that is part of the planning process, right? And part of the strategy is obviously trying to expend the money that has to be expended first in sort of the areas that we need to immediately, and moving the other money that we have a little more time with, and how can we leverage those funds to maybe get 2 or 3 years of services out of the total pot of funding, right? So I mentioned summer school. So we're not funding just one enhanced summer school program. We actually have 2 summers worth of enhanced programming given the funding that we're working with. So that said, we should reiterate that these are one-time funds and we should not be using them for ongoing expenditures, right? That's just sound fiscal practice. So we wouldn't use these funds to hire 35 new teachers that we would anticipate keeping for forever, unless we find resources to cover the salaries necessary for those 35 teachers. And anything that we do, we're very cognizant of the fact that we have 2 years at most, maybe 3 for some outlier programs, but these really are one-time funds. How can we best expend them with that in mind and get the best bang for the buck that really benefits our students in the long run? All right, we're getting down to the end here. So just a few more slides. Just wanted to turn our attention back to capital funds because, as I noted, school districts in California do not receive any funds for major repairs, for capital projects, or for major renovations of school facilities. So school districts across the state, all 1,000 plus of us, are left to turn to their local communities to look for those resources. Now, Poway, of course, is unique in that we have sort of the district as a whole, and then we have these smaller regions that we call community facilities districts, so CFDs. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about CFDs because we've done that a lot publicly over the last year and a year and a half. We can certainly, I'm happy to answer any questions, but it's all on our website. But the CFD funds, well, let's say it this way, the tax bonds that were generated through CFDs and that are being serviced, right, that are being paid back by the special taxes that our residents are paying, have specific uses, right, that have to be kept in mind. So when a developer formed a CFD, well, I think we have 16 of them, soon to be 17, he had a certain amount of land to work with. He had a development project in mind. He knew what the infrastructure was going to cost. He knew what a school was going to cost, et cetera, et cetera. We levied bonds as a school district on their behalf. And now, as those developments were built out, the property owners of that CFD are paying their special taxes to service the bonds that were issued to develop that land originally. And so those funds really have to be used on the schools and the facilities and the infrastructure within that CFD area. So we'd be hard pressed to use those funds broadly on CFDs that are outside, or for the district as a whole, outside of the CFD from which are originated. That's in contrast to a school bond, which is generally a general obligation bond, which is a voter approved ballot measure, unlike a CFD. And these we can use district-wide, and they're much more flexible, right? As long as we say how we're going to use them in the ballot language. And are clear about what projects and what's on the list of potential projects in terms of scope, we can use them in those ways. So we mentioned that again because, as you know, we just recently finished a long-range facilities master plan. I believe the board adopted it early last calendar year. It identified about $1.4 billion of need across our 39 schools, our district office, and our other support centers. And they fall out into these 5 categories. And you can see that to address those $1.4 billion of needs, currently we have $80 million at our disposal. So, you know, a pittance of what we really need to make some progress to upgrade our aging facilities. And then this is just a recap of those districts, as I mentioned, who have gone to their communities for support of a general obligation bond and their successes over the past 15 years. So you'll note that last year, 10 school districts, last year, 10 school districts put a ballot measure on the November ballot for a general obligation bond. And of those 10, 5 were successful, so half. You can see that many school districts have more than one bond that they've passed successfully. And then you can see how Poway compares. We've passed one bond, it looks like here, in the past 15 years, in 2008. And I would just say that that bond was, you know, relatively small, $179 million. I know that sounds like a lot of money. But when you're looking at, you know, $1 billion of need, that's not much in terms of tackling the Herculean task before you. So that's where we are in terms of GO bonds in San Diego County schools. And I think our final slide, I would just say that, you know, I hope that this evening's presentation has shed some light on the complexities of the funding model and the budgeting model of K12 schools in California. Even us that do this for a living find it pretty complicated and often cumbersome. And I think, you know, in terms of just understanding how we provide resources to meet the mandate and the good work that we do to educate our students through public education. We do the work because it's so important and it's necessary. I would also say that, you know, the district's leadership team and the district's board is committed and has been committed to sharing timely information, accurate data, transparent data with respect to how we're spending our money, how we're developing the budget. You know, I didn't mention it, but the budget development process here at the district is very collaborative, right? So our excellent director of finance, Ms. Ramiro, meets with department heads and associate soups and other budget managers to help them understand what their priorities are and what their needs are, and make sure that we can assist them in developing their budgets. Obviously, the LCAP is a very collaborative process. So again, as we navigate through the morass sometimes that is K12 funding in California, we try to do it transparently and report out to the board as often as possible. So with that, I think we're ready for any questions and answers. And thank you for your patience during that presentation.
Thank you so much, Ron. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us on, yes, definitely a complicated topic. I do see some questions coming in the chat. One from Dwayne, and maybe you can clarify, Ron. Dwayne asked, there are billions of dollars flowing, so why is a state deferral required?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And, you know, as as we said, the state starts developing its 2021 budget in November of 2019 and October of 2019. So by the time that they passed the budget in June, the writing was on the wall, right? And they were facing their own budget shortfalls and their own cash flow shortfalls. But for you know, that said, the pandemic obviously was a source of unanticipated resources, to your point, that the state received from the federal government. And I think that, to be honest, the state's own projections with respect to the receipts and the tax receipts have been woefully off, to put it nicely. And so you're right, they're exceeding their projections. And so one of the things the governor gave his May revise late last week, and we heard him say that he would entertain, move by the legislators rather, to prepay those deferrals, pay them down, use those billions of dollars extra that are flowing out there, as you say, to pay off those deferrals and get them off the books. So hopefully it'll come to pass.
Thank you. Yuli asked, can you shed some light on why frequent fundraising activities are needed when it looks like we're in decent funding position?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say two things. One is, remember that the district is the lowest funded unified school district in the county, right? So we're limited to what we can provide to schools in terms of their own specific needs. So obviously, our learning support services team and our superintendent board do a great job of making sure that schools have what they need for educating their students. But the peripheral needs, like a shade structure, right, or like additional field trips, those kind of projects that may have been included in a school's budget in the past, we just don't have the resources as a district to provide to every school now, basically. So schools are left to do fundraisers to raise resources for things like that.
Does PUSD plan to place a school bond measure on the election ballot in an upcoming election? And what election would that be? And I think some of the question is, what would be the amount, period of bond, total repaid? How would it be different from Measure P? So I don't know that we know all of the answer, but if you want to tackle some of it.
I think, to be honest, we don't know any of the answers. So all we know is the answer is no. The board has taken no action yet to place a bond on a future ballot. That doesn't mean that we won't. At last week's board meeting, I think was the first time that we revisited the subject of a general obligation bond under sort of the discussion about what to do with some surplus property that we had and how to leverage other district assets to benefit the district. And so the conversation sort of circled back to, well, it'd be great to use that surplus property for our own needs, like building a CTE building, or maybe a central kitchen with a farm out there that could raise, fresh produce that we could use, et cetera, et cetera. We can't envision those kind of things and imagine those kind of things without the resources to make them so. So I think that we're just begun that conversation. So over the next few months, I think we'll be continuing them. And so watch for those to happen more publicly.
If most funding comes from the state, then where do the property taxes go? Does it go directly to the state, to the city? Yes. And how does it ultimately get to PUSD?
That's an excellent question. And without getting into the weeds, yes. So remember that one of those Senate bills that we reviewed under the history of K12 funding moved the responsibility of levying local taxes from school districts to the state. Now, it didn't do that for city governments. So cities still have the capacity to levy taxes. However, school districts don't. So the state levies taxes on school districts' behalf. However, that said, because of Prop 13, the state can the state can most often not levy enough taxes in any given community to fund what we're entitled to as a school district based on the LCFF formula. And so the state has to make up the difference. So if you saw a pie graph, you'd see, the last I looked, you'd see like 40% or 35% of the pie is from property taxes, and the other 60 to 65% is from state aid. Hope that helps.
Thank you. California is in a budget surplus from tax. Can these not be turned more quickly? I think this is a follow-up to your original response.
I'm not sure what turned more quickly means, but you know, everything at the state level takes time, right?
That's an understatement.
It's true. It's true that we are now looking at a very substantial surplus at the state level, and so we're hoping to see some major initiatives and some major funding improvements for school districts in next year's budget. But again, keep in mind that some of those funds, you know, will be targeted towards new programs. So like universal kindergarten or universal preschool, right, is something that's near and dear to the governor's heart. And he's going to carve out some piece of that surplus to fund that particular initiative. So whenever there's a surplus, you're going to have people vying for those resources for their own pet projects, including, right, cities and county governments, et cetera, et cetera. But we are hopeful, and I would certainly anticipate that schools will be better funded, but that's not a good, better funded next year than we were this year. And the challenge, of course, is sustaining that, right, over time. So a one-time boost is great, but it doesn't necessarily help in the long run as we're looking at multi-year projections because of that practice of not using one-time resources for our ongoing operating expenses.
Does a school's individual ADA help determine that specific school's funding, or is it overall ADA for the district?
Good question. The overall funding for the district is what drives our district revenues. The way that ADA factors into a school is into sort of the staffing of that school, right? So obviously the number of students that each school has will determine the number of teachers that are necessary to educate those kids based on, you know, our ratios, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't do decentralized funding. I'm trying to think, maybe there's a couple districts in the state that actually parse out the revenues that a school might generate by its own students. Very difficult and not efficient, to be honest. But so no, everything is centrally driven here.
As real estate prices have risen, costs have risen, parentheses, inflation, and additional staff. So I'm assuming increased state funding would not meet the inflated costs. Is that true?
Well, it's a good question. The governor is proposing a super COLA of 5% for next year. So a cost of living adjustment of 5%. 5% of $400 million, right, is what, $20 million. So that's a significant, and that COLA is ongoing, right? So that's it. Well, COLA is 99% of the time are ongoing, right? So that's good. So that's $20 million annually more that we'll have to work with, you know, if that were to come to pass. So I think that we're in a pretty good place for next year, given that COLA, even though you're right, costs are skyrocketing. I mean, we just got our unemployment insurance rates and, you know, they've doubled for next year. So, but I think, you know, again, the COLA is significant, and even the out year COLAs that the governor is looking at are, you know, 2 or 3%. And that will help sort of us maintain sort of where we're at.
The amount spent on special education seems high. Why so much?
It's the amount that we spend on special education is pretty much in line with what every school district is spending in the state, I would say. We have a very excellent special ed program by all accounts, and so we have a large special ed population, and it it requires resources. And additional resources to help educate those kiddos. So it's not that it's a abnormally large number, it's that the funding is abnormally small by way of, I would say, the federal government. So we are hopeful that the Biden administration might be a little more friendly to school districts when it comes to special ed funding, and we'll keep you apprised of that.
Okay, I'm going to sort through some of these questions because we had a bunch from the same people, and I want to make sure others get a chance to ask some of their questions as well. Bear with me here. Are there any options for school repairs and maintenance besides bonds?
Well, we do have, remember those 5 capital funds we talked about? I can get them real quick. We can use some of those funds for our capital work. So right before I began here, I believe in 2017, we closed a deal on a surplus property that the district had. So the district sold a piece of property that it no longer needed. That generated, I don't know, something like almost $6 million. So that's $6 million of money that we have to spend on capital projects. Some of the money that we derive from developer fees. So, if a homeowner is doing some significant additions to his or her home, they pay the school district a fee. Some of that can be spent on projects if they're tied to sort of the students in the particular school or region. But generally, there's not a lot of pots of money to draw from when we're looking at major capital projects.
I heard that PUSD previously had a budget oversight committee that included parent and community representatives. Is this true? And if so, are there any plans to reinitiate this committee?
Yes, it's true. We had the last budget advisory committee, I believe, that we formed was, I want to say, in 2017, 2018. We went for about a year, maybe a year plus. Good representation from the community. It was a great committee, staff members as well, a couple principals. We at that time were looking at a significant structural deficit, and we were looking at ways to resolve that. There hasn't been much talk about creating a budget committee, but if it's something the board is interested in, we certainly could do so.
John talks about his issues with the capital appreciation bond.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, renegotiate the capital appreciation bond. I don't see PUSD bonds passing until this is resolved. Has the district tried to renegotiate the CAB?
Yeah, so without getting in the weeds, and we've addressed this before, the CABs are held by many different holders, some of whom we know and some of whom we don't know. Some of them are institutional and some are not. To renegotiate them, of course, we'd have to know, I think, and again, don't quote me on this number, but if I remember correctly, I think we know about maybe 50 to 60% of the bondholders, and the other 40 to 50%, we don't know who has the bonds, or they're closely held. Obviously, if we were to renegotiate, we'd have to have some funds to work with to renegotiate them, and those would not be that would not be an inexpensive proposition in and of itself.
The UPP model seems to provide the wrong incentives to seek or categorize pupils as UPP when they aren't really. Is this happening? And is there some means to audit this to more equitably distribute state funding?
That's a good question. I don't know that I would agree with the premise that the wrong students are being targeted. So remember, English learners are part of that group. Students from lower socioeconomic households are part of that group. And foster youth are part of that group. So these are students that data shows need additional resources to be successful in school. So I'm not quite clear who else we would include necessarily in those numbers, but I think they are actually targeted at the right students. And I'm not an educator. The superintendent might have some other ideas, but everything that I've seen looks like it's aligned.
How do our district's teacher compensation levels specifically compare to other SoCal school districts? Are they comparable, lower, stronger?
That's a good question. It's hard to answer because teacher salary schedules vary district to district, right? So there may be various numbers of columns on a teacher's schedule and various numbers of steps or rows. The last that we looked, and it was sort of an informal look, I would say that Poway was generally around the middle. And again, it all depends on what districts you're comparing them to. So are you looking at just similarly funded school districts? So school districts that have similar UPP numbers and similar levels of resources, right? Like we do? Or are you looking at regional comparisons and having to think about the inequities or the disparities among the funding levels of those districts?
When was the last time PUSD had to significantly draw from its reserves? And can the reserve target be reduced?
To my knowledge, the district has not had to dip into its reserves. We saw the 10-year history. If we went back, oh, that's not true. I'm sorry. Well, it depends what you mean dip into them. So let me go back to a slide here. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Oh, wrong way. So obviously you would anticipate dipping into the reserves like during the recession. So the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, if that were on this chart, my guess is that we dipped into the reserves that year. But you can see anytime this blue bar goes down compared to the bar before it, we're spending down reserves, right? So you can see just looking at 2019, 2020, right? We ended the year at 10.8% reserve level. The prior year, we had an 11.5% reserve level. So we spent some of our reserves to balance the budget. So if I recall correctly, that year, last year, I think we had a deficit of about $6.5–7 million. So that's how we funded the deficit, was with reserves. And that's why you want a prudent reserve. So you can see here this year from 2014-15 compared with the year prior, that's a significant, that was, relatively a significant dip into the reserves to balance the budget given the operating expenditures of that year. Could we reduce the target? I wouldn't recommend, in fact, I haven't recommended doing that. I think that 10% actually is a prudent target, and it may be on the minimal end of a prudent target. I looked at some numbers just the other day. I think on average, unified school districts throughout the state, on average, have somewhere between 16-ish% in reserves in 1920. So you can see that generally, I think that 10% is probably as low a target as you want to maintain.
What is the total budget, including staff time and annual expenses for formulating, implementing, and sustaining PUSD's recent racial equity and inclusion plan? And for the ethnic studies, history, social studies, CRT, we don't do CRT, but these types of programs at PUSD, would these expenses be itemized in the budget and financial reports?
They wouldn't necessarily be itemized in the budget per se, but they should be certainly delineated in our LCAP. And I think that some of them have been outlined in the in-person instruction grant. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head for those particular programs. If you want to give me the questioner's contact info, I'd be happy to follow up with them.
Yes, Ram, can you message Mr. Little directly in the chat, or message me directly in the chat your email address, please? Okay, Andrew asks, Ron, in your experience, what's the one push that needs to be made to not only make the district better, but what should be focused on? Bond measure passage, laws change of, more equitable disbursement, pushing elected officials to change? What is it? What's the one thing that can be pushed and maximize cost benefit for all? Is there that one thing?
That's right. That's a great question. I wish I had an easy solution, a simple solution. I would just draw your attention to the fact that if we were to look over the past 10 years of how states across our nation fund K12 education, depending on, who's doing the study, California typically falls somewhere between number 40 and number 50 in terms of funding by the state for its K12 education. So, the push needs to be, school districts in California need more funding from the state and maybe that includes, funding for capital projects, I don't know, but more funding to be able to maintain, and not only maintain, but add back in all those programs that we cut years ago, educational programs that we're doing without, so that we can provide a great educational experience to our students. So I think the one thing I would say is advocate for more ongoing resources for schools.
But more base funding, not those supplemental or categorical.
That's right. Yes. Good point. Yes. Thank you for that clarification. Right. Yeah. So, let's raise the base so that all school districts benefit.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for questions in the chat. I'm going to put Mr. Little's email, if that's okay with you, if anyone has follow-up questions, but really appreciate everyone's time who attended, as well as you, Mr. Little, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us to hopefully better understand how school districts are funded and how we spend our money, but also how we can, make it better. And because, here at PUSD, we're always working towards that to benefit our students. I have a question for the link to the slides. Let me put that in the chat as well. Give me a second. Mr. Little, did you want to add anything before we close out?
No, I just wanted to thank you, Ms. Peck, and thank Mr. Wall for the support this evening. I appreciate you guys staying and being of assistance and being part of this. So thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, again, for attending. And as Ms. Peck said, she'll put my email address out there for you. And I'm happy to, continue the conversation or answer any questions that you have. So again, thanks for coming this evening.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for your partnership.
Bye now.
Yes, let's push on those state officials to make school funding better. Thank you, Andrew. All right, Mr. Wall, I think we're good to stop our live stream and record.